I'd like to begin today by recognizing that while we are joining online from a number of places around the world, as hosts of the session today, we are located on an ancient and storied place in the Treaty 7 region. This land is steeped in history and ceremony, and until recently was used and occupied exclusively by peoples indigenous to this place. Learning from my valued Indigenous colleagues and from First Nations and Métis peoples, I've become keenly aware of the importance of making land acknowledgements that ask us to think more deeply and that are personally authentic and meaningful. So I'm hoping to share something with you today in that vein. In addition to learning from the wisdom of our guest speaker today, Dr. Josh Hill, who we will introduce more fully in a moment, one of the people that I've been fortunate to learn from in my own educational journey is Siksika Elder Roy Bearchief. When I was at Mount Royal University, I had an opportunity to learn from our Aspoomta or helper for the faculty that I was located in. And in speaking about land acknowledgements, Elder Roy Bearchief uses the image of a plow to show that the knowledge that most people have of the history of a territory is sometimes only 2 fists deep, the approximate depth that a plow can penetrate the soil. Elder Roy Bearchief's message encourages all of us to go beyond the depth of a plow in our educational journeys toward truth and reconciliation. And so we did acknowledge in the chat that actually it is winter here in Alberta and in many parts of Canada. It's quite a chilly morning. And admittedly, some of us find this more fun than others. I tend to go on the snow is fun side of the equations. And so I thought I would share with you a photo that I recently took on a journey into Shadow Lake, which is located near Lake Louise in the beautiful Rocky Mountains. Mount Royal University and the University of Calgary are both located on Treaty 7. And I learned from the making of Treaty 7 Cultural Society that this is a territory that runs from the Sweetgrass Hills along the 49th parallel to the Rocky Mountains that border Alberta and British Columbia. And you can see in the summertime the clear turquoise waters of Lake Louise, and then that land follows into the Rocky foothills and then to the place we are coming from today at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers, also known by the traditional Blackfoot name of Mokakiiks or the city of Calgary. So we would like to both acknowledge and pay tribute to the territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And I'm just so thrilled today to be here with you all online, and I'll turn it over to Michelle to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody. We're so thrilled to be continuing on this series after a little bit of a hiatus. So our intention here is really to work a little bit at the edges of scholarship of teaching and learning, and also creating a kind of a network that spans borders. Which seems especially important right now. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Josh Hill. Dr. Joshua Hill is my good colleague at Mount Royal, and I've had the good fortune of co-teaching a capstone course with him for teacher candidates a couple times around, and I'm missing it this semester, so really feeling that. Josh is an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Mount Royal University. Josh, his wife Melanie, and their 4 children live in Mokakiiks, near the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers. He's a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and his ancestors trace back to Métis and European communities. At the heart of his professorship is a commitment to ethical relationality. He strives to connect on a personal level with each student, which I've seen many times close up, with the aim of contributing to their sense of belonging and well-being. As a teacher educator, he's passionate about creating the conditions for teacher candidates to become the teacher they envision being. Through his scholarship, Josh invites teacher candidates, teacher educators, teachers, and educational leaders to partner with him to learn from Indigenous ways of being and restore education as a journey towards relationality, reciprocity, well-being, and sustainability. So please, I'll turn it over to you, Josh. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Just going to get my screen going here. See a thumbs up. Thanks, Sissy. Well, super grateful to have this opportunity to have so many folks spend their morning here reflecting on SoTL together, and I hope to create the conditions for us to think a little about our SoTL practice, the challenge of being brave. Uh, I was recently reading aloud a book, The Mysterious Benedict Society, with I don't know if anybody knows that book, but I was reading it with my son Ted, and the main character Rennie Muldoon is asked in a test if he's brave, and he reflects that he realizes he hasn't really had the opportunity to be, and answers the question honestly, I hope so. And that kind of resonates for me today. I'm not sure. Yeah, feeling a little more nervous than brave, perhaps, but we'll see if that edges of SoTL part. Yeah, maybe that's where I feel comfortable on the edges. And I kind of knew I might be a little nervous, so starting here grounds me. This is really my purpose in life, to be a connection between these two. This is my grandmother Evelyn and my daughter Micah Evelyn, and this photo was taken when they first met, on the visit that they first met. And I begin here not only because it encourages me today, but also because it's framed a lot of how I've been thinking about my career, and questions for me over the last 15 years as being a teacher and teacher educator. And in this moment of first meeting, these two are almost 100 years apart. So my grandmother was born in 1914, and in this moment, holding Micah, one of the things she said that's just stuck with me since was that she feels like what the exact words were. I wonder how much change this one will see in her lifetime. For sure, more than I've seen. And that it's been a moment of wisdom that stuck with me, thinking about how my grandmother was born in a soddy on a road allowance in Marine Lake, Saskatchewan, with a Métis hunter and gatherer family. And if we're thinking about the beginning of the 20th century, the sort of change she saw in her life, ranging from, she would talk about getting indoor plumbing and a furnace. Where are we grateful in Canada for our furnaces today? Thinking about things like automobile travel and, airplane travel, space travel. Earlier this day, she had told me about a conversation she had had with one of my cousins who was living in Abu Dhabi. And so, thinking about the change in that 100 years, and then looking at my daughter together and thinking about her lifetime. It was difficult to imagine that degree of change, and raises some really essential questions as a parent and a teacher and a professor who's working with new teachers and who's thinking about what knowledge is most important. And we have a responsibility as knowledge creators in our communities to really think carefully, I think. And for a while, maybe thinking about that amount of change was inconceivable. But at this moment, when we think about climate change, as I've learned more about artificial intelligence, as we face geopolitical uncertainty, it's seeming more and more like my grandmother's foresight was spot on. And so in these roles I've had, I've been thinking about a pedagogy for dynamic times. Like how can we create the conditions for young people to get what they need for an unimaginable future? And the best that I've kind of come to is that we need to find ways to support young people to adapt. We need to support them to engage in agentic action. Maxine Green is sort of like a guiding light for me, and she writes about imagination and sort of a pedagogy that might allow for the possibility of imagining things being otherwise or new beginnings. Yet, as I've journeyed for 20 plus years in the education system, I've seen that rather than adapting flexibly, our system seems to reinforce meta-narratives of compliance and conformity. And of course, this critique is not new, and nor are efforts to drive change. In fact, I feel like for most of my career, we've been talking about 21st century learning. We're 25 years into it, and my daughter's school is largely rooted in some of the same logic as my grandmother's. And I see meta-narratives of colonialism and industrialization at work all the time in the classrooms that I visit and in my own experience. In my PhD work, I went sort of back to school in a sense after having I never really loved school because I was always a teacher, but went back to university as a student, trying to understand a little bit about this repeated failure of educational change. Why was it that we would see glimmers of new beginnings in kids, yet in the system working at a level of the institution, change was so hard to come by. And I came to think that the very reform efforts that we were working with were underpinned by the same kinds of thinking that was the root of the problem. So that Audre Lorde quote of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house kind of seemed very sentient to me. So in my PhD, of course, one looks for a theoretical frame. And when one works with Dr. Brent Davis, who is a complexity thinker, network theory was offered a compelling metaphor for me to think about the system of education. And if you look at this diagram from Brent Davis's work with some colleagues, I think that the figure A, which represents a centralized network, is what a lot of the change efforts that I was a part of in education and continue to see play out, where we have at the center the teacher or professor in the classroom, and that direction that you see the nodes and connections, or the dean and the faculty, or the provost at the university. And that hierarchical structure is very stable and efficient with communication. Yet it is delimited by the number of ideas that can be at the center. It has a real lack of diversity. So I think what I've really experienced in terms of educational change is more like figures B and D, which are little pockets of innovation, little moments with colleagues, with students, with community, where maybe we do get to a space of thinking differently and unlearning colonialism together. Yet both of these lack the large-scale connectivity. So we don't have the coherence within this network structure from a network theory point of view for that to support system change. So what's left is diagram C, a decentralized network. And the way I understand that is what's significant in this diagram are these identifiable hubs that have meta connectivity, but also have branched off. And this is a structure that is manifest in all sorts of complex living systems. Many, many phenomena can be thought of as decentrally structured. For example, cells, our brains, social groups, the internet, even ecosystems. And one of the things that excited me about complexity thinking was that it gives us an opportunity to try to think across disciplines, try to be transdisciplinary, and allows us to look at different contexts to reflect on our own context. In this talk, I want to draw on this decentralized network metaphor, the structure C, and think of it as, as an educator. So all these different disciplines have ways of thinking about this structure, but as an educator, I think of it as a learning system. I think of it as a system that learns. And so in this frame, in this talk, I want to think about SoTL as a learning system, and then think about how that metaphor might help us think about ways we can contribute to SoTL for dynamic times. Essentially, I'm drawn to SoTL because of its opportunity to leverage diverse perspectives, knowledge and ideas of students, faculties, our disciplines, and our community partners. I see it as a vehicle of leadership that is collectivist and emergent, rhizomatic, responsive. And I think what I want to do today is I want to look at a few other contexts and think about this decentralized network, and then come back to think about SoTL and maybe hold that together a little bit with some of the SoTL conversations that have taken place that I've had the opportunity to be a part of. Some of the folks on this call have contributed to, but mostly open up a space, hopefully, for in our questions and response and chat afterwards for you to share how this metaphor might help you think about what your experience is with SoTL. So, complex adaptive systems. I right away think of my family. And I had a chance to go with some students to National Historic Site at Rocky Mountain House, and we met an elder named, Métis elder named Bernie Wallet. And Bernie said over and over again to us, the Métis people are highly adaptable. It's, I think he's thinking of it as our superpower. And this chair is actually sitting at, I don't want to change my computer because I'll surely mess something up. But this chair is sitting just next to me, and my son Joe is in that chair. And one of the unique things, I bring this chair into kindergarten classrooms, my kindergarten classroom, and now my students' classrooms, and we do a little "What do you notice? What do you wonder?" Because this chair was made by John Baptiste Latteroute, who's my great-great-great-grandfather, and it was made for his wife Marguerite, who's sitting in this other picture. And so when I heard this idea of adaptability and yet maintaining coherence, I thought about my family and all of the change that the Métis people have gone through. And so in this talk, I want to look at how Métis governance and social structures, ways of being, could be thought of as a decentralized system, and what that might offer us as inspiration for SoTL. The second context, once you start thinking like a complexity thinker, you see it everywhere. And I think it's sort of a curse. But this metaphor really resonated for me when I was at Sequoia National Park. So my kids and I traveled there, and to learn that these giant trees have been standing for 2,500 years, which is like 100 generations of humans that have come and gone in that time. And so needless to say, they have some things to teach us about resilience and about adaptability. And so interestingly, we tend to think about trees as individuals because that's what we see above the ground, right? But they're intricately connected under the ground in a community, and two can be thought of as a decentralized network or a learning system. So I'm going to kind of look at both of those contexts, the teachings of trees and the governance systems of my ancestors, my Métis ancestors, to think about what we can learn about SoTL. So first of all, really important in a decentralized network is the idea of connectivity. And so when we look under the surface of a forest, we begin to see how interconnected they really are. The mycorrhizal network, that picture that almost looks like a spider web. Every time we dig at my cabin in the Caribou, British Columbia, this is what it looks like under the soil. And of course, what that is sort of like a nervous system. Suzanne Simard talks a lot about the mycorrhizal fungi and the role that they have in networking within the forest. And so I like to think in SoTL as SoTL as a mycorrhizal fungi. There's probably a dad joke somewhere in there. Nonetheless, thinking about the connectivity that an event like this creates, or the conferences that we attend, the work of iSoTL, thinking about the journals that we contribute to. And one of the things that they talk about in decentralized networks is this idea of brokerage. And how do you create these connections within a network? What forms them? Nancy Chick talked about SoTL itself as a borderland, or a bridge that exists between disciplinary networks in our academy. And I've really been interested in that as I've come into the academy as an educator. SoTL seems close to home, but having an opportunity, because it studies learning and teaching, which is being my disciplinary language in a lot of ways. But one of the things that inspires me about being in the SoTL community is this opportunity to connect to scholars who are bringing their own disciplinary knowledge and ways of knowing into SoTL, and how that we can, in SoTL, create an interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary space. I'm also really interested in how we might speak back into our disciplines so that SoTL not only has disciplinary knowledge coming in, but the ways in which our SoTL work can reach back into our disciplines to share the knowledge we're creating in SoTL. Also in a decentralized network, and this may be getting a little over my science head. See, I'm stretching into a space of, I don't know, it's definitely not transdisciplinary, but it's really important in these networks that this brokerage exists between disparate scales. So in the forest context, we're talking about the mycorrhizal network interacting at the level of the watershed. So we don't just have, like in a hierarchy, where people have connection to their immediate subordinates, right? And that knowledge flows that way through a linear way. In a forest, we have this meta network, and there's exchange that occurs. And so again, SoTL, I feel like, is uniquely positioned in the academy to be leveraged to foster a meta network. It's, for me, I'm really excited about SoTL's ability to connect to students and bring students knowledge and experience and voice, and their needs, attending to their needs and engaging them as partners. There's great work, of course, inspired by my colleague Cherie Wolmer, and the international dialogue in SoTL around students as partners, and again, thinking about how in dynamic times, we need a diverse number of perspectives to support adaptation. It's diversity in an ecosystem, of course, that allows for resilience. And so how can SoTL bring in those, and our students have so many diverse perspectives, increasingly so in my context. Also, thinking about SoTL making connections into community. So the whole work of community engaged scholarship and the role SoTL can play to connect the university to the community and to learn from the needs of the community, serve the needs of the community. I'm really excited. Again, Nancy Chick talked about framing our questions and investigations we initiate in SoTL in order to engage public right in the very process of doing so. And when I think about the challenge of predicting the future, it becomes an impossible challenge to do individually. But if we create fungal connections out into the community, and it's really the community that is engaged in helping us understand what knowledge needs to be most important and engaged in that process with us. That's where I find some spaces of hope. Okay. Also, though, within this decentralized network metaphor that we're working with, connectivity also needs to have trust or closure. So brokerage gets balanced with closure. So if you remember those little clusters around those decentralized hubs, it's really important that there's an ability to communicate and have common language and trust within the sub-networks. And so I think about the network of my ancestors. Those of you who are not from Western Canada, the Métis people played a really foundational role in the establishment of the fur trade. And that canoe picture in the top right-hand corner, sometimes I've heard the rivers were sort of like the fur trade highway. And then the Red River carts, John Baptiste Latteroute, who we had earlier, he had about 5 Red River carts, and he essentially freighted as a trader between Pembina and the Red River. And so the Métis people played this brokerage role, but they also knew a thing or two about developing trust. And part of that meant building relationships. I've learned our Métis people have sort of many languages that connect to a central idea of Michif, but there's different dialogues and dialects of Michif. In fact, even separate languages altogether that our people spoke in order to be able to translate and to be able to build trust in all the First Nations communities that they were in close relationship with. And so, and to this day, like when I meet someone who's Michif, in fact, introducing myself today, it would be most common to share my family names because that we sort of we understand who each other are by tracing back to our family and build trust within community to, we came together in church parishes to work together in the communal buffalo hunt. And so this idea of closure resonates for me. And I think about it in the context of SoTL. So I've heard and experienced what McGowan talks about as the SoTL welcome. And, as an early career scholar, I guess a midlife crisis scholar, but framed as new to the academy, I really did feel that there was a space for me to access SoTL's big tent. But I also know that we need to keep reflecting and challenging on who's welcome in that tent and how do we create space of welcome in that tent. I know Bahari Leek, talked about the cultural boundaries of SoTL and how do we make those more permeable. Anna Leone talks about like transformative dialogue. In Michif, we have this word Peaksquino. It's like we will talk, and it's a real commitment to dialogue. And so I've been thinking a lot in SoTL about how do I contribute to dialogue across disciplines and dialogue, again, to bring, when I'm working with students as partners, what is the way that I can create spaces of dialogue? And one thing that's been prevalent in my practice is seeking to include Indigenous ways of being. I was inspired by Gabrielle Weaselhead when she did a talk at our closing keynote at our SoTL symposium that MRU hosts annually in the beautiful Banff Mountains. Shameless plug there, maybe Michelle. But she talked about the ways in which Indigenous ways of being might contribute in SoTL and might be welcomed into SoTL as a place of building trust. And that's something I've been exploring lately. And I'm wondering about, that idea of the SoTL welcome and hospitality and how we can continue in the teams we work with, the conferences, journals, institutes that we engage in. How do we ensure that there's diverse perspectives included in SoTL? My computer beeping at me. There we go. Another lesson from the Métis people and from trees is this crucial role of elders. So this is Elder Doreen Spence, and I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from Doreen. My daughter Micah, who you saw earlier, made a capote recently with Elder Doreen. And in Michif, the word for elders translates more to someone who knows. So sometimes there's this idea of elders being associated with being an older person, and that can be true, but there's elders in their 20s and 30s, and it's about having special gifts and expertise that are looked to for guidance. And in Métis communities, we've looked to our elders for guidance, particularly around sound judgment and their ability to know what's appropriate in particular situations. The Métis leadership structures are very fluid and consensus driven, and they need to be adaptable all the time. And it's the elders that play that role in our communities, and still to this day. So Elder Doreen is an elder for the Métis region here in our Otipemisiwak government. And in a forest, Suzanne Simard calls elders mother trees, and her research shows how mother trees are really a hub of the forest. In fact, some of her students learned that in like a multi-age forest, it's the Douglas fir mother trees play such an essential role in sharing resources, blocking out the sun to prevent small trees from growing too fast, which I thought was really interesting when we think about SoTL. And also, they recognize their kin. which I thought was really interesting, and play, but also share not just with their own species, but this carbon and information transfer occurs across species from these beautiful old trees. So, I've been thinking about how might we foster elderhood in SoTL, and what are the roles that elders play? And there's lots of great work on this. Sarah Bonnell, who I think might be on this talk, from Elon, and her and some colleagues took a look at mapping the generations within SoTL, and they talked about like Generation Zero, I think they called it, sort of the OGs of SoTL, perhaps, scholars like Boyer and Rice and Glassick, Huber, Schulman, and they really sort of played a role in founding the field. And I think part of what elders have provided me in SoTL is a theoretical frameworks to help us give us a sense of community, right? So when we have this, what represents SoTL research, and how do we make that as inclusive as possible? And also, there's work to consider the rigor that we must maintain. And so, at a recent conference I was participating in, Peter Felton's principles of good practice in SoTL were a common metaphor that was used across many different areas. So that role of elders in our work of SoTL, I think, is something to consider. Mentorship. I feel really grateful. Michelle, again, it's not about being old, it's about having expertise. I've had lots of beautiful experiences of being mentored into SoTL. At MRU, we have Mokakiiks Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, which has dedicated programs to support the entry of new scholars into SoTL and provide mentorship. And I know that this is the case in many other university contexts. And I wonder about how we continue to work to think about mentorship. Interestingly, Hubel and Clark identified that mentors provide three critical concrete practices. They model SoTL productivity, facilitate SoTL research, and enable SoTL networking. So that's really interesting. And this meta-network concept is how elders create the conditions for all of us to connect and share our work. Again, in a Métis community, there's this flexible and dynamic Métis laws. And I'm thinking a lot about how elders in SoTL can help us navigate the challenge of living up to that methodologically and ethically sound SoTL practice that we seek, while avoiding being so rigid, and that we get into a space of gatekeeping and therefore don't allow diverse perspectives and new entry points into SoTL. And I think there's tensions that need to be navigated, and I'm grateful for elders who can play that role, whether that's in journal editing and review. Think of many different contexts where they can help us find rigor and validity, while also having I really like this idea of well-defined and coherent flow from epistemology to methodology to methods analysis, and ultimately to the truth claims we make. Lastly, I wonder about this idea of elders in the making. So in First Nations communities that I've had a chance to learn from, Blackfoot culture in particular, there's very intentional and rigorous societies that involve transfers and a very critical process of developing folks to be prepared to step into the role of elder and have the knowledge and rights to play that role. And so I've been thinking about elders in the making in SoTL, thinking about U of S's work to develop a grad program with Melanie Hamilton playing a key role, and how important that might be to ensure that we that zero generation that I talked about earlier, they were defining the field. And Bonnell goes on to talk about this first generation and how many of them had to continue to be scholars in their own field first, and SoTL was sort of a secondary practice along the side. And I recently was thinking about how my work is really, I don't see those as nearly as separate, and I feel like there's a role to support the next generation towards elderhood in SoTL. Okay, still with me? We've talked about the importance of connectivity. We've talked about this idea of connectivity needs trust. And we've talked about elders as a key role in doing that within the network. I've got one more teaching from trees and Métis community and held together by network theory, which is this idea of being rhizomatic. So out in our beautiful cold world out there, I mentioned my kids are out at forest school this morning. They're playing in an aspen forest, and in that aspen forest, it can be seen, of course, as a whole bunch of individual trees. But I've come to understand that it's actually better thought of as a single organism. In fact, some of the largest organisms in the world are these aspen forests that we have right here in southern Alberta. And what's really interesting about rhizomes from a plant perspective is their ability to self-organize, for there not to be a single true center, but rather for centers to emerge when the conditions are right. The Métis Nation definitely could be think of as multi-centered. We certainly root our lineage back to the Red River, but even in the early times, there was communities that were organized around the forts and all across the Northwest. And so places like Turtle Mountain and Batoche, Isla Lacrosse, Edmonton, Prince Albert, and many wintering sites in between were hubs where people would connect at different times. Even in the Red River, folks often didn't live there year round. It was a place that they would seasonally return to. And this idea of decenteredness created a challenge in collaboration and coordination. Remember that fragmented network means that there's not enough meta-connectivity. And the Métis people, another word, that Otipimsawak word that I talked about earlier in Cree translates to the people who belong to themselves. And certainly there's a free spirit of the Métis people take off out to their trap line and not hang around to always be definitely not being told what to do. If I think of my dad and my son. Anyway, so there was this need though to have emergent centers to bring people together when it was necessary. And it was sort of a form of consensus democracy that you'd see in the Métis ways of being. Folks would have town hall meetings. They would be, and it was always a leader would emerge for the period of time that was needed to emerge. We think of Louis Riel, Cuthbert Grant, some of these great Métis leaders, but they never had a title that then gave them power over a long period of time. They maintained influence through dialogue, through emergent opportunities to connect. And then people would disperse again. So this is part of what allowed the Métis people to be so resilient, right? And so new hubs emerged after we were forced to leave Red River and continue to this day to have new centers of leadership and people who step into the opportunity. Our current government structure in our constitution allows for citizens to have a really big voice in bringing forward new laws. It's quite different than thinking about democracy in another framework. So again, to SoTL, I think about an opportunity for things like the international and national writing groups that emerge, where folks bring an idea to an opportunity to sit together and create new knowledge. I think about special editions of journals. I think about opportunities for folks to hold table conversations at conference events, and how built in that is to our ways of working in SoTL, and want to plant the seed for all of us today of what are some of the topics that are pressing. What are the special issue journal calls that each of us might write in order to have an emergent center and to have these ideas kind of combine, diverge, potentially become extinct and adapt, ultimately increase in complexity. Returning sort of then to the big picture of the talk, there's my daughter more recently. So she's a teenager now. She wants to do her learner's license upcoming. And of course, that makes me feel a little bit afraid and thinking ahead for all the change in her life. But you know, when my grandma was talking about change, it wasn't something to be fearful of or to resist. it's much more like the nature of things. And I've heard like Leroy Littlebear is a Blackfoot scholar, and he talks about like indigenous worldview, believing in constant flux and change as an ontology. And you think about forests, again, I think that they're not trying to resist change, right? They're not trying to drive or force change like that hierarchical, 21st century learning change that I was caught up in on a number of occasions. It's participating in cycles of change and adaptation is what I think SoTL can give us a space to do. And I hope that today we can connect a little bit. I've got my email address there. I want to stop talking and let other people talk, and hope that there's some places that you might jump in and share what's maybe given you a sense of connection to your work, and ultimately contribute to this SoTL network and our collective next steps. I think that when I think about my daughter and our, complex, dynamic world, it's really her that offers me hope, right? And that's that renewal of our common world. And so I feel like being a part of the SoTL community is an opportunity for me to contribute to conditions that will allow future generations to continue to evolve and change. And I wonder, what some of our next steps might be in that. So I'm going to say, we say Kawapameten, which is not goodbye. It's like, see you soon. I'm going to stop my talking. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I hope that there's an opportunity for folks to use the chat or put up your hand, and Erica and Michelle are going to moderate for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Josh. Really a lot to think about. I'm I'll watch here for anybody. Just invite you to raise your hand if you have a question, or put it into the chat, and Erica will watch for that. I have, just to start it off, I have a question or two. One of the things I was struck by was talking about the role of this kind of Sarah Bonnell's generational idea, and the people who are working as SoTL mentors, leaders, or elders in the making. I really like that as a thought, and wondering what the implications are in thinking about it in this way that you've laid out for us, for our work. So if folks are working, as I think as many people on this call would be, as journal like reviewers for conference presentations, or for journal articles, or doing editing work, are there implications in terms of the kinds of ethics or approach that we should be taking with colleagues in the framework that you've spoken about?
I think so. I think, you and I have wrestled with this, thinking about our role as teachers. Like, how do you both balance leading out, but also building up, right? And I've heard two root words of education, one to lead out and one to build up. And so, that idea of allowing the students we work with, in this case, the colleagues that are coming to us for mentorship, how do we both challenge them to think about how they can participate in SoTL in ways that align with the frameworks that exist in SoTL, but how do we think flexibly enough about those frameworks so that they can imagine things being otherwise? They can bring different ways of different questions, different methodologies. And so I think that humility of navigating that is something I try to bring to the way I give feedback to students, the way I work with research assistants, framing them as partners, and then but then thinking about what are the roles that I can play, what are the skills I do have that I can offer them, but then where do I create spaces to listen to them, and give the kinds of feedback that allows for me to recognize what they're really saying, and then or dialogue with them about what they're saying, and really bring them central into, like, rather than thinking I'm somehow a curator or even a gatekeeper. I want to think about how I can walk alongside and be a co-learner, and so not pretend I don't have things to offer to that dialogue, but also be humble enough to be listening for something that's going to surprise me. And that I think, like Gadamer, right, talks about that being a really difficult space to be in. A really difficult space of like dialogue is hard to find. But I think the best that I've found is bringing, trying to like unlearn my role as being too instrumental in the way that I'm framing criteria for things, being too like tied up on holding a particular way of being as and get bigger than methods, get to a space of methodology and ontology, and then work for an alignment between those. I don't know if that helps. That's a little bit of some of what I've been thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really helps. I think what, as you're speaking, what I was thinking about is how I think many people view themselves in relationship to their students, and all of Peter Felton and Susanna McGowan's work recently on relational education, and of course there's a long history of that kind of concept. But thinking about that in terms of our SoTL colleagues as well, because I think sometimes it's in with colleagues we tend to, in review processes anyway, we jump to that kind of gatekeeping kind of function and worrying so much about rigor and less about fostering imagination, which is something I heard you just say. So yeah, appreciate that. I can ask more questions, but just don't want to. Really want to open the floor to other. I see a couple of comments in the chat. Is there anybody who'd like to ask a question? Practicing my wait time.
I do have a question just while we're waiting for anyone else to chime in on the chat, and we do welcome that discussion to open up. Josh, I just really appreciate the part of the conversation that you offered around hope as well. And I think this topic will really resonate for a number of folks in different locations because I think we're in a time and space where a lot of these networks and connections are being sort of pushed upon or potentially pulled apart. And there is quite a lot of change happening that is, potentially really scary change. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the hope piece and how this connects to approaches to SoTL, approaches to leadership from that vantage point as well.
Mm-hmm. I was just presenting at our local teachers convention last week on Thursday, and we're looking at a new curriculum that's being implemented, and it feels like it's going to challenge teachers in a lot of ways. And but my hope, I believe in education, and I believe in the reason I believe in education is not the brick and mortar school structures and institutions, but the humans who are teachers. And in the university, I have my hope continues to be in our opportunities to do things like we're doing today, and to have the responsibility to sit together and talk about what knowledge is most important. And so maybe this new part of my hope in this new curriculum, and perhaps the hope in the grander, I'm not a political scientist, but thinking at the grander challenges that you're talking about. Maybe it's a space to nudge us to recognize our opportunity and our responsibility to take the leadership of the academy into our own hands. In fact, I've found moving from K to 12 to post-secondary, there's many more mechanisms for shared leadership through the shared governance models, at least in the academy that in Canada as it's conceptualized, compared to in a K to 12 school system. So it feels like there's more voice into curriculum, more voice into decision making than we might have. And so thinking about spaces like General Faculty's Council in our university, how could that be a space of dialogue where we contribute to navigating the dynamic times together? That's where my hope lies. And SoTL really being the connective tissue, right? So that when we're creating knowledge, there's an opportunity for us to be doing that in relation to what students need. relationship to what the community needs and across our disciplines. That's so exciting to me. So yeah, there's a little dose of hope.
Thank you very much. I think uh, Nicola Simmons was writing something down or in progress of writing a message. So I also invite you to use your microphone or camera. Feel free to use the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you very, very much for this. Some really lovely ideas in this, and something you just said just grabbed me. That notion of SoTL as connective tissue, and I've been listening to you talking about the trees and the forest and the what's underground, and you just jumped me right into thinking of SoTL as the body and the connective tissue and how that connective tissue is, allowing that fluid movement of the body. So, okay, where's my question in all this? But I was just really excited that that came to me. Where are we now, and where could we be in 5 years, and how would we get there? And that is, there's lots of pockets of innovation in SoTL. There always have been. What do you see as a couple of the big steps that SoTL could take and that maybe SoTL Canada could support? And thanks for thinking about that.
Yeah, you're going to force me to be brave. Hey, it is a brave conversation. It's hard for me to think about what others need to do, but I'll tell you some of the things I'm really excited about currently, which includes, connecting people to the land through my SoTL practice, and even through the way that I engage in SoTL scholarship. So that includes, getting out with elders on the land, sitting together in circle, being having seasonal teachings. I'm working on taking some colleagues. I'm going to take some colleagues to on a land-based faculty field school upcoming, and so that we can learn from elders in the land, and together that can help us think about what our next steps might be in our own practice. I'm leaning a lot into circle as a way of being within my SoTL scholarship, in how I write through Métis-Sage, but more than just the composition, the entire relational practice of coming to know together through that way of being. And I'm trying personally to reframe some of the structures that I feel compelled to think differently about, and that starts with, for me, getting out to the land and getting learning from elders, including Indigenous language. So you heard me try a few humble opportunities of describing how Indigenous languages are inspiring me in my practice as a researcher and a knowledge creator. I hope that gives you something to think about. Thanks for the question. And I love that extension of the metaphor to think about the body and then the different systems. And the cool thing about the body as a metaphor is that we have, again, we're not individuals in the way we sometimes think we are. So like our microbiome is interconnected with like billions of, there's more cells in our body that are not our own body than are our own. And so, yeah, that metaphor really works, because with that, thinking about how are we engaging at disparate connections, thinking about how that metaphor can extend that way inspires me. Thanks for offering that.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, and thanks, Nicola, too, for turning us to, what action can we all take? Which I think there's lots of practical implications for how we proceed and what Josh has said. So, yeah. So I just want to, on behalf of everybody, Josh, thank you again for being here and sharing with us. And lots of, hopefully you're seeing the thank yous in the chat as well. I think I forgot to actually introduce myself at the beginning, so I'll close with an introduction. And Michelle Yeoh, and I direct the Mokakiiks Center for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Mount Royal. And this series is really a partnership with Taylor Institute at University of Calgary, with Erica Smith, who was a good colleague at Mount Royal, but we're maintaining our relationship through this series. So thank you all for attending. I'll turn it over to Erica in a moment. And I think she'll maybe let us know about the next, watch for the next session in the series.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thanks to Michelle for collaborating on this event. It's wonderful to be able to use this virtual space to really connect outward too with so many colleagues from different spaces, and to bring colleagues from Mount Royal and University of Calgary and other institutions in Alberta as well, SAIT and others, here to this conversation. So the conversation will be continuing. We have two upcoming sessions. The next one is on March 19th. And after that, we have April 15th. And so watch for those ads coming out. We really do want to sort of push at the edges of some of these conversations and have these conversations around coming to action and what kinds of networks and collaborations can we forge together in order to grapple with these very timely and often very complex topics. So I'll end by putting all of our emails in the chat. Thanks to Josh for putting his on the screen as well, in case you want to connect with us further about topics or ideas that you may have. And just thanks so much for everyone for being here. And we hope that you stay warm and that we will see you online on March 19th for our talk with Anna Santucci, who will be joining us about further conversations at the edges of SoTL.